Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Dennis Inholson, Chief Learning Officer for the National Art Education Association. Tonight, you're in for a real treat on your pathway to finding funding to help your students. Tonight, we have Davis Publication, who's sponsoring this event. And with that, oh, and by the way, the chat box is open. Feel free to use that. And with that, here's Tony Henneman of Davis Publications.
Thank you, Dennis. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tony Henneman, and I'm the Marketing Director here at Davis Publications. As you may know, Davis is dedicated to art education and art educators for more than 118 years, and our mission has always been to provide superior resources that support art educators and inspire students. While this usually covers classroom materials, we know that one of the biggest challenges is funding. Over the last few years, Scott Benson, Davis' National Sales Manager, has worked hard to educate our sales and marketing teams about available funding options. Today, we're thrilled to share that fantastic resource he has used to teach us about the grants landscape. So please welcome Scott Benson.
Thank you, Tony. Good evening, everyone. My name is Scott Benson, and I'm the National Sales Manager at Davis Publication. As a partner with NAEE, we're pleased to be sponsoring your presenter today, Dr. Paula Love, President of RFP Match. Paula has spent more than 40 years in education as a teacher and administrator, and now as a leading expert on grants and funding. During her long and incredibly successful career, Paula has developed a deep understanding of educators' funding needs at national, state, and local levels. The funding doctor, as she's called, is a perfect match for our webinar today. And you will find lots of great information about ESSA, grants funding, and here is the funding doctor. Go ahead, Paula.
Thank you so much, Scott, and welcome everybody. And look at this first picture. Have you ever felt panicked if you've been taking an exam and right before it, that feeling of anxiety? So often when I just mention the word grants to people, that feeling of panic sets in. So today we're really going to try to help you dispel some of that fear that you may have around those grants. But more importantly, we're going to look at some of the ways that will get you to a yes. Yes, I'm going to fund your product or project, and yes, we're going to give you that cash to go along with it. So we're going to look at some of those ways today to be able to do that. Before we do, I'd like to tell you a little personal story. I know Scott had mentioned a little bit about my background, but I want to dive in by just telling you a little story about myself. When I was 7 years old, I decided that I was going to rally a whole community around cystic fibrosis. So what I did was I recruited all the neighborhood children. I produced a play, I wrote the play, I directed the play. I had all these kids in the neighborhood put on the play, and then I went door to door and I sold tickets. Well, needless to say, all of these people showed up at our small little home. Tons of people knocked on the door. Neither one of my parents knew that I was they knew that I was playing around with the kids downstairs, but none of them had a clue what I was doing. Everybody was there to see the play, and I even sold refreshments during the play to make money. We raised so much money for cystic fibrosis that at 7 years old, I was on the front page of a prominent newspaper in Baltimore, Maryland, as the youngest entrepreneur. Now, I tell you that story for a reason. The reason is the belief in what I was doing. And that belief followed me through my career. When I was a teacher, I not only did fundraising, but I also learned about the wonderful world of grants. And I wrote grants for my students to get things. When I was administrator, I wrote grants for the teachers. When I worked at the State Department, I wrote grants for local school districts to be successful. All of those grants really boils down to the belief in what I was doing. So today, again, I'm going to tell you to ditch this fear, replace it with the belief that your project in art is really worth the time and effort. So I want to hear from you, and I especially want to hear you say to me, Dr. Love, I got a yes. They said yes. Yes, we love your project in art, and yes, we're going to be sending you the funding. And by the way, folks, down at the bottom of this slide, there's an acronym, RFP. RFP really stands for Request for Proposals. Many of you might know that. It's used in many different ways when we think about RFPs, but for the sake of our talk today, we're specifically going to talk about grants. Now, let's lessen a little bit of that anxiety and let's look at those 7 effortless ways we're going to get you to your yes. Today, we're going to focus on, first of all, where the funding flow is and how to find those funds. I'm also going to give you, throughout this presentation, what I call some funding doctor tips, some tips on making you successful. And then we always need to keep in mind that in all of this process, it never ends. So we always want to keep funding forward. So let's move on. And let's look at effortless way number 1 in understanding the funding flow. Let me tell you another little story. Paula lives in rural western North Carolina, and I have horses, and I love to ride my horses up in the mountains. And oftentimes when I'm riding the horses, I see the little trickle of water coming out of the mountain, or I stop to let my horse drink out of a creek, or even better yet, I like to take my boots off and stick my toes in that water along the stream. But I'm telling you that because water flows from many different aspects. And what we need to remember is that grant money also flows from many different sources. So today we're going to look at some of those sources. So bear with me a little bit as I give you Funding 101 and really take a look at some of those sources. They really come from 2 main areas, public funds and private funds. And the public funds, we think of things like the U.S. Department of Education, maybe your state education agencies, the National Endowment for the Arts, and other state agencies like arts councils. In the private area, we see more things like corporations and foundations and private philanthropists that step up and give some money for certain causes. Now I want you to look at that flow as those arrows go down, and you look at that red arrow from the public. You're going to see that that money in the public flows in 2 ways, formula, and it flows as competitive. Now, if you look over at the private side, it only flows to that competitive area. So let's talk a little bit about this formula and this competitive. To review these 2 forms of grants and the way they flow, I want you to think about a cup of coffee. If you're like me, it's my morning have-to-have, but it serves us very well to illustrate the differences, not only in coffee, but the differences in terms of grants, because funds breathe the life into our education programs. It is the way that funds come down and the way that we use them. But it's very important to understand the 2 forms that we have. So let's take a little deeper look at these forms. What I'd like you to think of when you think of a cup of coffee is the way that you might take your cup of coffee. Some of us use a drip coffee maker, where there's certain coffee and grinds, and we have a formula, and we put them in, and we get our coffee. And others, like that espresso or that cappuccino, that more exclusive version for how we get our coffee. That's almost like funds. Funds can flow through a formula. Some funds are allocated. They're allocated based on a formula or certain populations. Other funds we have to compete for. There's a limited pot of money. In the formula, everybody might get a little something, but in the competitive, there may be a bigger pot of money and only some people get that pot of money. And that side of the picture, that competitive side, is where sometimes that anxiety comes from, the panic when we talk about grants. But even so, we need to always remember and kind of refocus the importance of the two forms that grants take. So let's look at some of the federal grant funding that's out there. First of all, let's look at the breakdown of federal funding. And this is really a critical slide to back up what I said in terms of the formula and competitive grants. Notice that most of the federal dollars that come down to us, and even a lot of the state dollars, come down in formula or block or allocated amounts. And only a small piece of that pie really is looking at those competitive dollars. So why do we place all of the emphasis and panic sometimes when we think of those competitive dollars? Now, I know some of you are probably looking at this slide and you're probably saying to yourself, Dr. Love really made a big mistake on that slide because she has a fund, 21st CCLC, which stands for Community Center Learning Center money. She has it in both places. Well, we're going to explain about that in just a second. But please keep in mind that both of these forms of funds help us form a well-rounded funding strategy when we're thinking about funds. So let's take a look at some of the federal arts funding that's out there right now. If you notice on this slide, these are some of the big funds that are out there at a federal level for the arts. The star means that they're formula funds. And the little medallion there in blue are really ones that are competitive. And again, look at that 21st Century Community Learning Centers. It has both the star and both the competitive. We're going to be talking about that. So let's first go to the Title I, Part A, Improving the Academic Achievement of the Disadvantaged. This fund is a formula fund. It comes down based on socioeconomic needs of students. Often we used to use free and reduced lunch. But now the federal government is using more census data to ensure that not only elementary and middle school students get access to this fund, but also those students in high school as well. This fund is so important for you in the arts. First of all, it is one of the largest federal buckets that is out there for formula grants. But embedded in this fund is talk all about arts and education. So if you haven't talked to your decision makers or other folks that are involved in Title I, begin your conversation now. Those particular grants, and this is a funding doctor tip, those particular formula grants require a needs assessment by the local district. And the needs assessment sets up the solution for what those funds can be spent on. So talk to your decision makers, make sure you're involved in the process, and make sure that the arts and education is part of that needs assessment. Now let's move to 21st Century Community Learning Center Fund. This operates in both ways. First, it comes down to states as a formula grant. So all the states get a portion of that money. The second way is that then the states send that money out as a competitive grant. So they send it out to local school districts, to faith-based groups, to community-based groups. They send that money out as a competition. And those competitions vary all across the state. For instance, right now, New Jersey has an open competition and it's due April 25th. Texas has one out due on May 13th. North Dakota has one out. It's coming up. It's due April 5th. And Arizona has one due on May 6th. All of those timelines for those competitive dollars vary by the state. Now let's move to the next one. Title IV, Part A, Student Support and Academic Enrichment. And wow, the arts is a winner. You are a winner in this fund. Finally, the arts has taken its place back at the table. You know, for years, we operated under legislation called No Child Left Behind. And arts often was struggling, especially when it came to funding, to find a place to belong. But then some changes happened in December 2015, and the Every Student Succeed Act came about. And as a result, the arts came back into funding, and it found its place. Title IV, Part A, Student Support and Academic Enrichment. You're going to see the words throughout the ESSA, or Every Student Succeeds Act, all about well-rounded. The arts is part of that definition of well-rounded, and the well-rounded funding finds its home here. It shares that home with two other areas, and that's school safety and health, as well as technology or personalized learning. But importantly, it has its place there. It is spread throughout, the well-rounded is spread throughout all the legislation, folks, but it's just a great opportunity for us to have a formula grant now at our disposal. So again, I encourage you to make sure that your decision makers and making sure that your projects are talked about with your decision makers so the arts does sit at the table at your local school district. And then the last one, the National Endowment for the Arts has continued to be a big supporter in arts and education. I like to think of this as the cappuccino of the competitive grants. So if you're not familiar with the ArtsWorks grants, please get familiar with them. It's a great opportunity as a competitive grant for you to look at some of your arts projects. Now, I have a little personal story here that I'd like to share with you. Dennis and I were talking about, while we were talking through this presentation, and he suggested that I might want to share it with you. And it's very important and it's very near and dear to my heart. And it really explains why the arts are so important, and so important to me when I was working with writing grants at a local school district level. Back when I was teaching first grade, I had a student that came to me from kindergarten, and all the principals and the other decision makers told me that I needed to put this student in special education. Now, it was pretty hard for me to understand how a child could go from kindergarten and be designated special education in first grade. But they kept saying, no, we tried all interventions. She really needs to be in special education. Well, at that time, we were a Title I school, and I had an instructional assistant, and I went over to her, and I said, you know, this young lady, her whole family is incredibly talented in music. And if she can sing like she does, then we can teach her how to read through her art. And that's exactly what we did. Her name is Toni Braxton. You may have known the famous singer. Her family is now on television all the time, the Braxton family. But it was my honor and privilege to have her in my first grade class, and more importantly, to remind me of the importance that art takes, not only in projects that we're doing, but also in the funding to support those projects. So as we move past this slide, and Dennis, don't move it yet, I want to go back to it. Can you go back to it once? I just want to remind you first about the formula grants, those ones with STAR. always begin in mind with those formula grants first because they provide sustainability. We know those grants have staying power. They're coming year after year. So they provide a stability to your project. But if those funds are used up and there are no available funds in those areas because either they're taken by staff or other projects, then please turn to the competitive next. Because competitive grants, especially grants like 21st Century Community Learning Centers, are not one-year funding. They're often, especially when they're public funds, 3 to 5 years. So they can provide a means of stability for your program. However, always have a plan when those grants go to move your grant into some other kind of funding source. And that funding source probably should be those sustainable formula funds so that your program does not die when the funding dies. That is critical during the planning phases and thinking about your project in the arts. Now we can go over to that next effortless way, number 2. Okay, up to this point we've talked about the funding flow and the way that the funds come down. But now we're going to change our focus to helping you find those funds and look at the match. And in order to do this, we're going to begin with a little history lesson that I've already talked a little bit about, but it is because of this little history that's happening right now, not little, it's big, but this big history event that's happening, funding focus has changed and finding funds has changed. And it has changed because of the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. So let's look at the new roles and what's happened as a result of ESSA. As I mentioned to you before, in December 2015, I call it an earthquake happened in education, ESSA. It really did usher in a totally different twist to school spending. And it did it by shifting the decision-making responsibility from the federal office to the states and locals. Look at some of the fallouts that happen and some of the new roles. Look where the local is right now. Look at that where it says grants to meet local needs. Think about what I said about local decision makers, local school districts applying for their formula grants right now and having to do needs assessments based on their needs. That is critical right now as we're looking at what is happening with funding. So let's take a look a little bit more into this shift into decision making. We have lesson control at the federal level, more flexibility at that state. Really, that shifting, that earthquake that happened in the educational landscape. Now states have power and authority in policy, but also in their funding decisions. Folks, this has created confusion and uncertainty. We are changing the way we've always done things, like in Title I. And as a result of this, a lot of states and locals have stalled, or even, they're not even sure right now how to spend or how to use this new decision-making power. And that means that our spending practices sometimes need some explanation of how our projects can effectively align back to the funds. Again, needs assessments that I mentioned before. Think about your case for needs, but beyond needs, we also need to make a strong case for evidence of effectiveness, because funds are looking for projects that have track records, evidence, staying power, projects that have been around the ability to show that they make a difference in student learning. And when you're looking for evidence, don't forget to look at the U.S. Department of Education for the evidence in arts and their research behind that. Don't forget to look at the National Endowment for the Arts and other sites. And also take a good look at the Education Commission of the states, because they have some great tools out there as well for supporting arts in education projects. But most importantly, speak up. Help craft the language out there about the importance in a well-rounded program for student achievement. So let's take a look now at how these funds are coming down and what's happening with some of the laws, as I mentioned to you before. There's a lot of funds swirling out there right now, and the ability for us to go after them. As I mentioned, a lot of the public funds have staying power, especially in the competitive area. More of your private funds sometimes are not as long-term, although it does happen, but most of them are really to jumpstart or really help you get started with some of your projects and everything. But both public and private funds are moving more and more towards that evidence. As I mentioned to you before about the Education Commission of the states, they have some really good documents right now, and one of the ones that they're looking at, or one of the ones that they have done a lot of research on right now, is the 11 states plus the District of Columbia that includes arts as part of their accountability system. Why is this important? Because we know what gets measured often gets funded. So know where your state falls. Go and look at some of those reports and understand where your state falls. So let's look at some of the samples of what's out there right now at the state, because as funding is shifting and more is moving to the state, we are seeing a tremendous amount of funds pop up at state levels. For instance, there's one out in South Carolina right now. It's all around arts projects, but more importantly, how the arts support student achievement. And that particular grant is out right now and is due April 9th. There's another one out in Missouri that does very similar. It focuses in on curricular projects that involve the arts, and that one's due April 6th. Other projects that I've seen and other grants that I've seen emerge are things like what you see on the screen here in Georgia and West Virginia and Pennsylvania. And every day we're seeing more and more opportunities that are coming at the state level. So where do you look for these funds? Where do you find them? And Dennis, if we flip over to the next slide, there's tons of information out there publicly that is available about where grants are. But sometimes it's hard to sort through all of those funds and try to figure out, where do I go to find the grants that I need for my specific project? One of the places that you may want to look at, and there's a couple free sites out there, but grantsalert.com is one that a lot of state departments ask or tell their educators to go to find free opportunities for their school and school district. Like I said, the funds are public information, but often staying abreast of foundation and private funding as well as that federal funding is a challenge. So let's look at the next effortless way. In part of this, we also need to remember the match. It's not just important to find the funds, but we have to think about how the funds that we find really match up. And what do I mean by that? You know, you might read a funder that says, oh, I'm really interested in the arts. But you really need to go a little bit deeper to see if they are the right match. Most funders now require a logic model, a theory of action. And if you don't have this for your arts project, I strongly encourage that now you start thinking about the elements that make up your art project and also the outcomes of where it's going to go. There are many resources out there on logic models. They actually begin from the private sector, and we're seeing more and more federal grants and more state grants now requiring the logic behind your project. I often used to call this years ago a conceptual framework, but it does serve you well for looking at that right match. So while you're looking for funds, or even before you start, consider writing a logic model. And then take that logic model and begin to identify the funders and narrow your search. Now by that I mean, take a look at that funder. Look at their website. Look at what they've funded in the past. Really start narrowing down your search. And then take a look at that funder's mission. Does it match yours? And as you do all this assessment, really be honest. Don't just chase money, but rather really look at, is this the right opportunity for you and this project? All right, let's go on and let's look at Effortless Way number 3. We talked a little bit about the match, but this is really know the funder. So let's dig a little bit deeper now and let's find out what it means to know the funder. And Dennis, if we can flip over to the next slide, we're going to go deep and we're going to look at some things that you need to do when I say know your funder. First, you do your homework, as I mentioned before. Research the funder. Go to their website. Read, if they're a private funder, read their financials. Look at what they've funded previously. If you can, reach out to some of the awardees to get a better picture of the funder. Many times, a lot of the federal grants will actually list the application that won online. In fact, the Education, Innovation, and Research grants that are current, that were out and due today, actually had the awardees from 2018 and a copy of every single grant application for those awardees. You can get your hands on some samples, look at them, not to copy them, but to get some examples for how that funder and the kinds of things that funder was looking for. Then, be really good about matching the mission and goals. Take a look at what that funder really wants to get out of that grant, because remember, they're giving money to further their mission and goals. Your job is to see if that mission and those mission and goals actually align for your strategic direction or where you're going for your project. So look at those mission and goals. The next one, the eligibility to apply. This is critical. Oftentimes we see a grant, we think, wow, this is really good. And then we get to it and it says only an institution of higher ed, which is our colleges and universities or maybe community colleges can apply. Or maybe it only says nonprofit organizations can apply. That might be a problem. Perhaps you've got the nonprofit designation. Most schools and school districts do. And even some schools and school districts have their own foundations now, which makes them eligible to apply. But always consider, if you cannot be the lead applicant, partnering with another partner to accomplish your mission. Then the next thing is looking at the process. Is it an application? Most public grants require an application for you to submit for that funding. But more and more private funders are inviting proposals. They may have a letter of intent that you do online, but a lot of times they don't even have a letter of intent. They're inviting you to do a proposal. Well, how do you get invited? Well, that's the next piece. Connect. Connect with the funders. Don't be afraid to reach out to funders ahead of time, especially private funders. Ask them questions. Talk with them. Talk about your project. Go over that logic model. Don't connect with a funder until you're prepared. So be prepared by having your logic model and being prepared by also explaining how you fit their mission and goals. But a good way, especially when you're working with private funding, is to do a little connecting with the funder. So let's move on and let's look at Effortless Way number 4. The funding doctor wants to leave you with one tip, and if there's one thing I can tell you in this presentation today, one thing that you leave with today, it's read, read, read that application. The number one reason that grants fail, number one reason, is because people fail to read the application and follow the directions. It sounds so simple. It sounds like everybody should be doing that. But folks, I have, as Scott mentioned, I have been in this business for over 40 years. In my entire career, whether I've been working at locals or states, or I've been consulting, I can see right away people that read the application and follow those directions because their application and their process is organized, and those that don't. A funding doctor tip here. When you're reading the application, give yourself a bunch of highlighters next to you. Take a color highlighter and highlight it for formatting. So if it says page numbers or font size, or if it's double spaced, highlight that in one color. Take another highlighter, and as you're reading it, look for buzzwords in the application. Look for those keywords and phrases, things that stand out like blended learning or online learning, or a special something unique that you're looking at. Take another highlighter and look at who they want to direct the application to. It might be for limited English language proficient students. It may be for learning disabled students. It may be for high needs students. And then you need to figure out, well, what do they mean by high needs or at-risk students? But take your highlighters, use your highlighters, and then go back and look at that document over and over again. Above all, if you leave with one thing in this presentation, know that you should read the application. All right, Dennis, let's move over to the Effortless Way number 5. Remember when I told you about panicking at the beginning, panicking for that test? Well, a way that you can kind of bring down the panic, especially when you're doing a lot of grant writing, is seek help in the writing. Don't do it alone. Get others involved with you. There's so much opportunity for shared ownership and greater buy-in. It requires sometimes some leadership skills and some facilitation skills, but don't go it alone. And let me give you a funding doctor tip here why. Many times you get down to the end of writing the grant and you don't have everything together and you decide not to submit. I've seen it over and over again. But when you get a team involved and you get everybody buying into the project, often they will find some money to help support your project because you've put in so much time and effort and energy together. So don't go it alone. So let's look a little bit deeper into that, why it takes the team. Well, you get these multiple viewpoints, people challenging you, which is good because then you look at, do I really have a need here? Is it really something? Am I just focusing on a product that I want? or is there really here something that's going to benefit, and how is it going to benefit students? You pull talent. There's great opportunity when you have a team. There are people that are taskmasters. There are people that are big thinker people. There are people really good with the budget, but pull on those talents. You get the buy-in. That is so critical. It is so important that one person just doesn't write a grant, but you have multiple voices coming in and multiple stakeholders so that you have buy-in for not only that project, but for its sustainability. You can also share resources. A lot of times grants ask you to match some funding. By getting a team involved, you can maximize that and share some resources and share some ways that you can all contribute, be it cash or maybe some in-kind matching by services and other things that they can bring. And also it affords you the mentors and support that you need, because grant writing can be a very lonely process. So we don't want you to do it alone. But as you're doing it and as you're working with the team, I'm also going to give you a funding doctor tip here. It is very important that your grant application read almost like a story. It needs a voice. It needs a strong, persuasive voice that flows throughout it. And when you have all these people contributing, you sometimes lose that voice. So once the contributions are made towards your grant, determine a lead writer. It may be you, or it may be somebody that's got a talent in writing that can pull it all together. But make the document read smoothly and compellingly in one voice throughout. Hey, let's take a look at Effortless Way number 6. Okay, up until now, we've talked about all the strategies going into grant writing. And now we're going to shift a little bit. And we're going to shift and we're going to think of funding forward after you submit that grant. So after you submit that grant and before you bank that check, don't forget to say thanks. Thanks to your team, thanks to your stakeholders, thanks to your funder, thanks to all the people that contributed to that project. And as you're writing your thank you letter for getting the award, also ask the funder for why they chose you. Why did your proposal stand out? And if they will share with you any strengths or weaknesses, that's very, very helpful as you move your project forward and look at future funding for your next project or to scale your current project. Now, what do you do if you stink? It's not a no. It's just that you need to go back a little bit, maybe look at fine-tuning your logic model and some of the things that you're doing, but it's a learning experience, folks. It's about the project. It's not about the win. It's about the project. So if you truly believe in your project, like I said at the beginning, then you take that no, you go back to the funder, you ask them, you say thanks, you ask them for their score points, you ask them for any strengths or weaknesses. If they won't give it to you in writing, ask them if you can call them and just talk to them a little bit. Most of them are really happy to debrief with you a little to explain what were the strengths and what were the weaknesses, and then you take that and you move it forward because it's the project. It is the project that you're believing in. So that leads us to the final slide and the final effortless way. What I said at the beginning when I told you that little story about me believing in cystic fibrosis and rallying all that community towards that project is where I want you to focus. I want you to focus on your solution that meets a need in terms of students. You may have lots of wishes out there. You may want a lot of things. But in order to be able to get the resources for your project, your arts project, ultimately, You've got to figure out how the art is making a difference in the learning outcomes of our students. So focus on that, and then the initiative can indeed become effortless and a labor of love for you. At that, I'm going to end, Dennis.
Thank you, Dr. Love. We don't have any questions coming through yet, but I'm going to start with a really quick little story. Just today, I and a colleague virtually were reading a grant proposal, word for word. I love that advice. And honestly, I had my highlighters ready, and I got writing all over this. I'm not an experienced grant writer. There's a lot of detail here, but what we were able to do is to go through the grant and sort of determine who would contribute which parts to the grant. So your comment about building a team, I thought was really helpful. And believe it or not, in this grant, they're requiring a logic framework. So it's a perfect day to talk about grant writing with our members. The other piece that I noticed was the idea of a sustainability project. You know, the one and dones probably aren't as effective as those projects that we can look out over the long haul. Funding maybe to get things started, but what will happen over time? So thinking back when I was in schools, and so popular right now, in fact, there's a Davis book on it with media arts. A lot of art teachers, our members, are interested in media arts, just as an example. So I'm wondering, Paula, how would a teacher who spends his or her day, all day, with students, how would they even begin the process of saying they have an interest in media arts, just for example, and they want to push it and start some really exciting things going on in their school?
My advice would first of all start small. Look at some of the local foundation and corporations. You know, when I was teaching school and I wanted to get a few resources for my classroom, I turned to some of the banks and the local people, and I was able to write a small grant to really get me started in grant writing. On the Grants Alert site that I mentioned to everybody about on this call, we have some resources on there about some strategies for how to get started in grant writing. So always think about, especially when you're a teacher, you need to start small. You need to keep the focus on what you're doing, not on product, but on the solution around where you're trying to go for your students, and your product becomes part of the solution that you're proposing, part of the activities that help you get there to make a difference or the outcome of students. The other strategy that I would also encourage you to do if you are a teacher is look to the summertime to also think about when you might be able to either find those resources or begin thinking about your conceptual framework, your logic model. That facilitates some of that time when you have some downtime, let's say, and I know many of us don't have downtime anymore, even in the summer, but when you have some time to be able to do that, that you can focus in on those things. The other thing I will tell you, when you write a grant and when you go through the process, it really hones in your skills on project design and project management. It really helps you fine tune. So as a result of going through the art, if you're writing, you know, something in your school district for school improvement using the art, you're going to be a better writer by just spending a little bit of time in understanding the grant process, because the grant process really helps us fine-tune the ability to really put our ideas down and really move it forward. Start small, build on those small little steps, and build them forward. Don't stop with one project. Build on that same project. Take that project and leverage it in different ways. So you're not doing one idea and then dropping it and finding another idea. Build on your idea so that you continue to grow that idea. Then it doesn't become as hard or thinking about multiple different grants that I have to apply for that may have different ideas or different things in them. Small, building on your ideas, Dennis, is the way that I would tell people to do, and think about the summer.
That's excellent. Thank you, Paula. Still no questions, which is just fine. Reminds me of the very first grant that I received. I was a 24-year-old art teacher. Got a $20,000 grant. I was also a cross-country runner and a coach. And I could achieve so many things with that grant. We built a nature trail for running, a place for my art students to go and draw and paint in nature, a place for the community to go. The science kids were doing water samples in the ponds. We built a bridge. We had local partnerships with carpenters. There were so many exciting connecting elements to that grant that it was almost indescribable. Was it art? Was it science? And the answer was yes. We have a question from Tara. I've heard before about making your grant writing a story. Can you talk more about that?
Yes, and that's very important. Thank you, Tara, for saying that. It is important that you have details and kind of the way that the grant is laid out, but you also need to keep in mind the folks that are reading these, the readers that are looking at it. They need a hook. They need something that is going to motivate them. They're going to look for what makes your project unique. Why does it stand out? Do you have a theme through it? Do you tell kind of that story throughout it? Now, when I tell you to tell a story, I also caution you. I've spent a lot of time not only writing grants, but also reviewing grants. And, you know, I've often said about telling a story. And one time I was reviewing grants at the federal level for some big federal initiatives. And I pulled this grant application out to review it. And this person had a gorgeous story. They were in a wagon train and they were going up the mountain and they were setting the stage for their grant, except they had 10 pages talking about their story and nothing when I got to the meat of the proposal. When I finished reading the grant, I always close the grant and I try to say to myself, so what is this person trying to accomplish? Where are they going? The story compels the reader. It uses your artistic talent. It compels the reader, motivates them to keep them engaged. But while you're telling a story, do not forget the details of the grant. Grant writing is a combination of being very persuasive, but it also requires being very technical. You have to have timelines in there. You have to have clear, measurable outcomes. You have to know where you're going. You have to be able to evaluate it. But you have to hook it all together. It's all got a line. And then you know what? You also have a budget to do. And the budget has to say the same thing in numbers that you did in words. It has to tell that story. So often I would read grants and I'd be reading along and then I'd flip, and as I'm reading, I'd stick a little dollar sign out on the side to see if indeed that would be something that I should see maybe in the budget. And I turn to the budget and all of a sudden I've got staff in there, project directors that weren't even mentioned about in the management plan. I've got 20 computers that no one ever even mentioned about when they were talking through the grant. So tell your story, do it with detail, hook the reader in, get them that wow punch at the beginning, wow them at the end is what I usually say, but make technical pieces in the middle and then ensure that your budget matches what you say. I hope that answered your question, Tara.
That's a fabulous piece of advice, Paula. I'm going to have to do that with this grant proposal, is to correlate what we want to do, our passion and our story, with real budget items and make sure those are aligned. I appreciate that. But it doesn't seem like we're getting very many questions. We have still Tony and Scott out there. Tony or Scott, do you have any questions? Don't forget to unmute.
I don't have any questions, but I did want to just mention the free resources that we've put together on the davisart.com grant help landing page. Paula put together a fantastic synopsis, basically, of everything that she has covered here in this presentation in our grant planner. So I welcome you all to visit that landing page and download the free resources.
Thanks. Well, with that, I just want to say once again, thank you, Davis Publications, for recognizing that our members and future members out there will be searching for funds. And with the help of Dr. Love and others, maybe they can dig deep, build that team, and create a great proposal that will last for years to come and benefit the students.
We got a question down there Tony could answer.
Yeah. Can we get a copy of the slides? Yes, the slide deck will be available at NAEA and probably through Tony and Davis Publications. And let's see, one more question from Yanzu. Are those grants for all public schools? Could private schools or studios apply for those grants?
That's a great question, and much of it goes back to the eligibility of the grant. Most of the formula grants that I mentioned are for school districts, but a lot of the private funds enable other groups to go after. So remember when I talked about the eligibility? Take a look at who's eligible to apply for those funds, because that's where you might be able, especially if you're private schools or you're a studio, might be able to use some of those funds to go after initiatives that you want to do.
And I believe we're just about out of questions. And once again, thanks all for joining us this evening. Thanks again, Davis Publications. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.